Been in this study of a discussion about surrender, really, and surrender over to the Savior, surrender to God, and in various aspects as it relates to that. And this morning, I want to come back. We're tail end of lesson 9. I want to come back and just pick up a couple of things that we didn't get a chance to talk about Wednesday night at the very end of lesson 9, and then we'll move on most likely. Never know. But most likely, then we'll move on into lesson 10 before we close. But there's an interesting concept I want to make sure that we understand before we move forward. In our study on Wednesday, and not to recap all of that because then we wouldn't have time to finish what we read. But I want to go back though just for a moment and remember, I should have pulled this up on the screen first, that we had that discussion about Galatians 6, 1 through 10. We talked about the various aspects of that. And towards the end of that narrative, he talks about the concept of you reap what you what? What you sow. But the challenge for us in relationship to that, and so in essence, what he's reminding us of is simply this. If I surrender myself unto God, I sow unto my spiritual purpose and dedication that God has given me. And I do that every day and every day and every day. But the harvest comes when? Potentially. Yeah, much, much later, okay? Sometimes the harvest, the reaping of what we sow comes at a much, much later time. And therefore, I believe that's why Paul says there, don't grow what? Don't grow weary in well-doing, for ye shall reap in due season, right? We have to remind ourselves in this surrendering of life unto God, this surrendered purpose that we have as servants of Jesus Christ, that we sow today for the benefit that comes ultimately eternally. But even the fruit of that labor spiritually may not come to fruition for some time later. And then go back into the cultural concepts that we talked about on Wednesday night. That's challenging for us because we're used to things happening when? Right now, right? Everything's instant, everything's fast, everything comes at us in a hurry. And so we're very used to kind of that instant gratification kind of mindset where we're able to receive whatever it is we're looking for in a quick pace. It doesn't work that way with our spiritual surrender to God. That we have to not grow weary in the process because the reaping will come much, much later. And I wanted to come back to that because then he illustrated that with a couple of Old Testament examples that I thought were worth at least a few minutes of our time in relationship to this discussion. And he begins that conversation by talking about whom? Abraham. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 12, that is when God comes to Abraham really for the first time to issue a promise to him. And yet, how long is it before he really begins to see the actual seed promise, the Isaac coming on to the scene? So it's roughly 25 years before you get to the point where Isaac comes. So a promise was made, and Abraham had, 25 years for it to come to fruition. And what's interesting about that is, did Abraham grow impatient in that process? Yes. And we know that because what happened? Ishmael happened. Hagar and Ishmael happened in that process where and Sarah's not, by the way, unaccountable here either, right? Kind of her brainstorm, and Abraham's not really wise enough to go, I don't know about this. This may not be a good idea. This probably could cause some trouble after the fact, and did it? Yeah, it caused a lot of trouble after the fact. But he grew impatient with the process. It was going to be a while for Isaac to come on the scene. He turns his attention to a man like Joseph. Joseph had dreams when he was what? 17 years old. And those dreams basically were he was going to what? He's going to rule over. But it sure probably didn't feel that way when you were down inside that pit, did it? It sure didn't feel that way when you were sold into slavery. And it sure didn't feel that way when you end up in an Egyptian prison. And it sure doesn't feel that way when the guy you helped get out of that prison kind of forgets about you for a while. It probably didn't feel that way. But ultimately, it came to the point where he not only was just a ruler, but in a world that was struggling outside of Egypt, he was really the what? Number 2 guy in Egypt. Only the Pharaoh was ahead of him, and in many senses, he was almost his equal in terms of power and influence and ability to rule. And so it takes time and patience. David spent over 10 years gaining experience as a shepherd, a warrior, a fugitive who depended on God before he became king. Right? He was appointed to be king long before that. But he basically has to wait out the time period in which God determines for him to actually begin to rule and reign. And it's interesting with David is that he could have shortcutted that, right? What simply would he have had to done in order to shortcut that process? Kill Saul. That's it. If he had just decided that he was done running and done fleeing and done showing mercy in some senses to Saul, he could have just slain Saul, shortcutted the process, and not waited on God. But he waited. How long before Jesus really starts getting into the work that he intended? About 30 years. Now, Jesus knew who he was for those 30 years. He knew exactly who he was for those 30 years. In fact, we have a glimpse of that when he's about 12 years old, right? When he's in Jerusalem, the family had traveled. Go ahead, Ken, I'm sorry. Yeah, he understood the purposes and that he should be about his Father's business. And he's even got the ability to astound the brightest and most intelligent of the Jewish population with his knowledge and ability. And yet he waited for the purposes of God to unfold in the right times and in the right manners. The point simply is this. Sometimes when we surrender our lives over to God and we sow to that purpose, we sow to that spiritual purpose, we can become frustrated if we don't feel like the results are happening fast enough. And because they're not happening fast enough in our minds, the tendency is to want to stop. The tendency is to want to step away from those promises and benefits that God extends to us. And that's when we need to remind ourselves of men like Joseph and men like Abraham and men like David and even our Savior himself, who patiently waited for the right timings and the right purposes and the right things. And some of those things may be what? That's a weird way to ask that. Do we see and know all of those factors that are going to happen between point A and point B? No. Go ahead. Yeah, they're unknown, right? Abraham was simply told, get out of the land in which you live, and you've been comfortable for so long, and go to a land that I'll show you. Abraham has no concept when he leaves what's going to happen from point A to point B. He doesn't know all the difficulties or challenges that might present, but he surrenders himself to the purpose. Nobody's got the right. We don't have that future ability to know everything that's around the next corner. We don't know what stumbling blocks are going to be in the way. We don't know what life issues are going to arrive. We don't know what's going to happen. The commitment is to get from point A to point B. The commitment and the surrender is that I'm not stopping somewhere along the path because it gets discouraging or it gets difficult or there's unanswered questions or there's challenges I didn't expect or things occur that I didn't think that was going to happen to me anymore because now I'm a servant of God and I thought everything just kind of got rosy after that. And we've got to get past all that kind of thinking. And a genuinely surrendered life unto God, a genuinely surrendered purpose unto God will help guide me in understanding that there's still going to be some bumps and challenges along the way. And he makes an interesting point there. I don't know if you can see it on screen, but he says that time is a human concern, not a what? Not a divine concern. Time, in some senses, is a human concern. We're the ones who become convinced that if it doesn't happen in this span of time, then it can't or won't. God doesn't think that way. God's mind doesn't think in the same concepts of time that you and I do. He's not relegated to the timings of human experience that we so often succumb to. He makes another thought there at the end of that paragraph when he says, things that evoke a well done from God may what? Produce what from men? Yeah, big deal, right? So what? And so we got to also not, in this surrendered process, not just think about, am I going to be patient through it all? But am I also going to be willing to say, that has value, even though men may say it doesn't? Am I going to be willing to say that this purpose-driven life in relationship to God, am I surrendering over to them, has value because God said it had value? And because that's who I'm trusting, and that's who I'm valuing. When the human condition that is around me might be telling me the exact opposite. It might be telling me that all this reaping that might eventually even occur to me spiritually isn't really worth it anyway. And so we have to be ready to overcome that in this long-term purpose of serving God. Thoughts or questions about that? I just wanted to make sure I came back and talked about that a little bit before we wrapped up Lesson 9. All right, let's move on. Lesson 10. And Lesson 10 talks about the idea that we need to surrender to what? We need to surrender to grace. And he goes in, and I'm not, again, he uses a lot of illustrative kind of things in those first 4 or 5 paragraphs. I don't want to necessarily hash out because that's his approach in some senses. Sometimes we can, you know what I mean, we could sit here and discuss those things. Is that right or wrong, or is that the way I would have described it or not? And we're talking about irrelevant matters because he said it, we didn't necessarily say it. Here's the point he's trying to make. There are challenges, and if you read through all first 4 or 5 paragraphs, you'll see that he basically says there are challenges if we feel inferior, and there are challenges that if we feel superior. We've got to be careful that the extremes of those two things, the idea that we have no worth and the concept that we have too much worth, can both be detrimental in the process of embracing the grace that comes from God. And he talked a lot about all the various reasons why, or the circumstances that might come up that create in people's minds a sense of inferiority, and there are all kinds of things that might make people feel inferior, and then the reaction to that is to try to create scenarios and language and vocabulary that kind of erase those stigmas of inferiority and trying to lift people up and those kinds of things. And then he talked about the pendulum swinging the other way. The idea then that we can also give people too much self-worth to the point that they feel superior to others, and their reactions and perceptions of self become problematic when it comes to that. And when we begin to think about ourselves too much, and I want to take a look, if you can find it on your sheets, where it says personal attitudes of worth and merit, and I'm showing it to you on the screen as well. They said personal attitudes of worth, merit, and deservedness that are commonly imposed on people are easily imposed on God. That's where I want to get to this morning. That's really where the problem lies. Because when you get a mindset that I am owed all the time, my employer owes me, society owes me, the church owes me, my family owes me, God owes me. That's the difficulty that we create sometimes. When we get into that mindset of that everything is deserved, and the struggle we have really, particularly for all as Americans, as citizens of this country, is that we're bombarded daily with things that we're told are rights. You have a right, you have a right. Now, don't misunderstand me. If you want to talk about that from a governmental standpoint, that's a whole different kind of conversation. Okay? Governmental rights are perfectly well within its own narrative. So if you want to talk about rights as a citizen, and rights from a government standpoint, and rights from a legal standpoint, that's a conversation within itself. The challenge we have is that we don't begin to think, well, because I have all of these legal rights or American liberties that have been extended to me through bills of rights and constitutions and law, that somehow that translates to my spiritual life, because it doesn't. Who has really all the rights when it comes to my spiritual walk? God does. And I've got to surrender to that. God doesn't owe me anything. He doesn't owe me anything. He's promised me a lot of things, right? And He gives us everything. But not based on merit. Based on His character. Based on who He is. He gives, He promises, He sustains, He cares, He loves, He's kind. He's all of those things based on His character. And the challenge we have sometimes to surrendering to grace is a willingness on our part to surrender to the idea that everything that I receive from God is through that grace. It's never, in a sense, about me and how good or how wonderful or how great I've become. And we've talked about that already in this study, by the way, in some issues. But we have to be very cautious in a society that is very driven by the idea of trying to remove any kind of sense that anyone would ever feel inferior to anything, that we don't adopt that concept as it relates to God, because the truth of the matter is, all day long I'll be inferior to Him. All day long, every day of the week, I'll be inferior. I am. And by attempting sometimes to eradicate the sense of inferiority in all these other secular places, it can bleed over into our spiritual concepts and thought processes, where we begin to think the same ways as it relates to our relationship to God. We don't make deals with God. We're not looking for the bargain salvation that He might be offering, where I can strike up some kind of deal. It's not about a checklist of necessary acts, but it's about the grace of God, not of works that I should boast. Go ahead, Gary, I'm sorry.
When I was studying this past week, the second paragraph there, the first sentence or two, where it says inferiority does not and cannot exist, and then it asks the question why. And then this very next statement really, it just hit me. Every person has value worth simply by existing.
Yeah.
And that leads us into a whole book of interesting spiritual innuendo.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, and be honest, and maybe I'm reading it different than others here, from where the author of the material led us, and that's why I'm careful not to parse out, because I don't necessarily know where his mind was, but I think he's speaking of that in a negative, in that point. I think because that's his point in those first several paragraphs. He's speaking about that in a negative sense, as it relates to when it challenges us spiritually. But the truth is, we do have value because we exist, but only why? Because how do we exist? Because He created us. Because God created us. So our value, again, so don't feel inferior to anybody else in the sense that somehow you're a lesser creation, because you're not. But on the other side, that's not what society is saying. What society is telling you and I on a regular basis, that you be whatever in the world you want to be. You have a right to feel superior just being who you want to be and how you want to be and live how you want to live and act how you want to act. And don't let anybody ever tell you anything otherwise. And that can lend itself to us not wanting to give our lives over to God, but rather living by a human standard that can create challenges. Again, I don't think the author nor am I saying that we ought to purposely make people feel inferior, because that's the opposite end of this spectrum that he challenges. He also challenges the superiority complex, where we do feel like we're better than other people, and at the end of the day, we're not. And at the end of the day, we have the same obligations to the grace of God and surrendering to it as everybody else does. And so we've got to avoid this pendulum kind of process where both of these extremes, in some senses, can create difficulties in embracing the grace of God.
In a spiritual sense, we are all created.
Yeah. With all created with the same opportunity, same sense of purpose that's governed by the will and purposes of God. And so in that very sense, the value we have is not necessarily based then on who I've created myself to be, but what I was created to be by the hand of God. And that's the difference. And that, again, in this whole discussion we've been having over the past several weeks, that lends itself to maybe something you think, are we really splitting hairs here? Are we? And again, the idea is not necessarily, we're not necessarily splitting hairs. What we're doing is making sure we put the proper priority in place. And my value isn't based on some greatness that I've earned and merited myself. My value is because of what God has created me to be. And that's the distinction. But we don't view it that way. When I say we, I'm not necessarily pointing a finger at anyone in the room. I'm just saying we in general as a society don't determine people's value. We determine people's value on occupation. We determine people's value upon their academic successes. We determine people's value based on whether they can shoot a basketball very well or not, or whether they can throw a football a mile away. We base their value on whether they've risen to political standings. We place all these weird concepts of what we value to the point that we can negate the real value that we have that came by the very purpose and nature that God has created within us. That's where we need to get. And if we're going to get there, it's vital to do that, because otherwise we may very well miss out on the very unmerited favor and grace of God that He's trying to extend to us. If we're being bombarded and buying into all these human concepts. I'll pause for a breath. All right. So when it came to the Corinthians, did Paul have a lot of respect among them? No. They struggled trying to really get a sense of what they should do as it relates to the Apostle Paul. Let's start in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 1. He said, "And I, brethren, when I came to you, came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and Him crucified." Now let me stop for a moment. Let's get the picture here. So, when you would think of Paul as a preacher, as if you were viewing it from the eyes of the Corinthians, would you have valued his speaking style or even choice of material? No, because he's not very deep. That's what he said, right? He said, when I came to you, I wasn't very deep. There wasn't any excellency of speech behind it. There wasn't any great sense of wisdom behind it. In fact, there was an extreme simplicity about it. He said, when I came to you, I talked about what? Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And so if your charge against me is that I didn't come with fancy speech and I didn't come with real depth of thought, that I came to you with a message of simplicity of Jesus Christ and Him crucified, Paul says, guilty. Guilty. When I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. You know, I've often wondered a little bit about this, and it's hard to quantify in some ways as it relates to Paul. We know that before he was the Apostle Paul, he was who? Saul of Tarsus. And Saul of Tarsus, was he popular? Not among the Christians, but among the Jews, yes. And so much so that he was rising in power. And so much so that he was able to go to those rulers and say, hey, put me in charge. I want to be the guy in charge of wreaking havoc on these newfound Christians. So I want the letters. You send me. I'm going to go and I'm going to drag them out of these cities and places that I can find them. I want to be the guy in charge. He rises to that prominence. So, one of two things. Either he was able to accomplish that without what we would typically qualify as political prowess, or his conversion changed him. Because when he begins the process of becoming the Apostle Paul and begins to go into these communities and begins to speak, he doesn't appear like someone, if you saw him in person, he doesn't appear to be someone that you would necessarily rally. He would be the guy, if just based on these statements that he made of himself here in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, if he would be the guy on the debate stage politically you'd feel sorry for. Because you would say to yourself, if you watched him, you would say, boy, he's struggling. He's struggling. He was inferior. When it came to the ability to communicate and speak in ways that people would have been fascinated by or drawn in by, the things that Paul did weren't the kinds of things that would immediately draw the focus and attention of people. And they began to think of him as inferior because of it. They, in Corinth, began to think of Paul as somebody really they ought not spend a whole lot of time being concerned about or thinking about. Go to chapter 4, verse 1. So when he continues to describe himself, he says, let a man so count of us as of the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment, yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing by myself, yet am I not hereby justified, but he that judgeth me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts, and then shall every man have praise of God. Paul was trying to get them to see and to understand that they may challenge his abilities, but what has merit is the message that he's presenting. Paul says, I want you to adopt the message of grace and mercy and the crucifixion of Jesus, not based on my ability to proclaim it, but because the message has value. The message has benefit. They saw themselves as better than Paul. They saw themselves as superior to them. We could pick one of our own guys and could probably present a better lesson than Paul could in the public forum anyway. And because they felt superior, they felt like they didn't have to what? They didn't have to listen to him. That what he had to say, they didn't have to pay attention to, because, after all, he didn't have quite the skill set that others might have had. They challenged Paul on all kinds of different issues. Let's jump to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Oops, sorry. He says, do we begin again to commend ourselves? Or need we, as some others, epistles of commendation to you or letters of commendation from you? You are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart, and such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. Repeatedly, over and over and over again, Paul finds himself in a need to defend himself before these Corinthians before they'll ever want to consider or think about the merit of the message that he was presenting. Their superiority was getting in the way of hearing the clarity of the message of the gospel that Paul had repeatedly been sharing with them. And it's interesting here, he says, listen, you want a testimony? You want a letter? You want some kind of authorized documentation that everything's great and I'm on the up and up here? He said, you're my letter. Your response to the gospel is evidence of the value of the message. The benefit that it's brought to you is evidence enough. I don't know why we keep having this discussion, Paul says. But when people feel superior to others, there's a temptation to not want to listen. I know of men who've been rejected in conversations and studies. I think actually Dennis spoke of that when he was here, how there was a seminar that he was at, that when he began to speak, they asked him his credentials. And when he didn't have a doctorate in theology, they told him to be quiet. Because without a doctorate in theology, he had no business even beginning to discuss or talk about these matters. That his thoughts and message had no merit simply based on an academic credential that he failed to have. Superiority can create problems when we think that we're superior to the messenger. We can transcend that by also then beginning to believe that we're superior to the message. And that's a challenge that we have. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 10, they basically tell him, you're awful. You're just not very good at public speaking. Even though your writings are tremendous. But to see you in person, you're just not that impressive. And what's interesting to me about that has always been, in some ways, it didn't seem to rattle Paul. It didn't seem, you know what I mean? It didn't seem to, obviously didn't change his focus and purpose. He didn't let that deter him from the purposes that he was striving to fulfill. And yet the real issue here was not whether Paul should or shouldn't be a good speaker, or whether they should value that or not value that. The real core issue here is simply because they didn't value his skill set, they didn't value his message. And that was the challenge. And that created a problem for them in receiving the benefits of the grace of God that God intended for them to receive. And so repeatedly, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul has to defend himself. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, find Paul defending himself all the time, just to get an audience with these folks who had really the privilege of having various men work with them, by the way. And I didn't talk, so let me pause for a minute and go back to that. He didn't talk about that in this lesson. Go back to the first letter for a minute in your mind's eye if you can. And when Paul begins to write the letter to Corinth, the first letter, and he said there was a division among them. You remember that? And he said their division, remember what it was? What was it based on? Who had baptized them? Some say I am of Apollos. Some say I am of Cephas. Others say I am of Paul. Paul says, but who's for Christ? Which one of your group? Why are you dividing up this way? But it's interesting to think about. So then think about that just for a minute and think about it from a human mindset for a moment. So they had been introduced to various speakers. and they were aligning themselves based on whichever one was compelling enough for them to decide to be baptized by them. And Paul actually goes back and says in that very narrative, I'm glad I didn't baptize very many of you at all, because I don't want a faction of Paulites running around Corinth based on that. But to me, it's interesting that Paul continually has to defend his message with them, but it's one of the few places that have had a series of different men come and go where they were actually able to kind of compare. Some places didn't know anybody but Paul, so there's no comparisons ever being made. There's a danger sometimes in placing value based on comparative thought. And they were comparing, everybody was comparing to Cephas or to Apollos or to Paul or to whomever. And because this comparison's going on, there's factions and divisions among them. And not really the real value and importance of examining the message of grace and salvation in Jesus Christ. Again, the point's very simple here. Inferiority can to its extreme can make us believe that we don't have any value to God. Superiority can make me feel like God owes me because I'm so good. And superiority can also cause me to ignore some clear and important counsel and instruction simply because we didn't like the vessel in which that message was coming through. And at the end of the day, I don't want either extreme. I don't want to be on either end of that spectrum. What I want is to simply embrace what God's purpose for me is and to accept the grace that He extends through the promises of Jesus. That's what I really want. Go ahead. Yeah. And that's been the thread woven through this whole study, is to avoid that self mindset. And both people that feel inferior sometimes can get that self thought going, and people who feel superior get that self. And either one, if it's focused on self, will ignore God. And that's where the real challenge is. Go ahead, Jim.
When Paul started out first preaching, a lot of people were afraid of him.
Yeah.
He's constantly, all the time, has to defend himself because.
Yeah. It is interesting that when he initially begins to preach and teach, they were afraid of him. But notice how he described himself when he came and preached in Corinth. He described himself as somebody who'd never taught a lesson before ever in their life and stood up in front of a group. He said, I was shaken, I was trembling, I was in fear. He describes himself in the very ways that some of his earlier audiences felt. As Saul of Tarsus is now the Apostle Paul presenting these messages. But there was obviously some, as in those in Corinth particularly, who took issue with the manner in which Paul was doing his work. All right. That's the thought process. When we come back Wednesday then, let's dig into 2 Corinthians 12, and let's start, Lord willing, this discussion out of that text about the importance of surrendering to grace and removing these inferior and or superior kinds of mindsets about self that we need to get